With the Super Mario Bros. 40th anniversary showing no signs of an original 3D Mario title, the perennial question facing Switch 2 in this period remains: when will this 3D Mario game come out? In this video, I want to not just unpick the implications of 3D Mario's non-showing in the September Direct, but also to discuss one possibility that this presents as a consequence, a possibility that might see not just one, but actually two 3D Mario games by the decade's end. First, though, let's be clear what this 3D Mario no-show rules out and rules in. I think it basically rules out a 3D Mario game release before the movie, which is in April 2026. There was always a long-shot chance of it making March 2026 if they announced in September. 7 months as a hype cycle is relatively short, but longer than Mario Kart World, let alone Donkey Kong Bonanza. But I think that's now pretty much impossible, as they would surely need a substantial hype cycle to launch a game as massive as we currently expect the next 3D Mario to be. However, it seems that they've opted not to reveal the game now. Why would they not? Well, there are a few possible reasons. One reason would be if the next game featured Galaxy characters and locations and Galaxy content, and they wanted to make sure that Super Mario Galaxy 1 Plus 2 sold well before introducing their new title. After all, it would be a Pyrrhic victory if people decided to forego the current games because a new Galaxy-themed title is just around the corner. Why would people not just wait for the next major 3D installment instead of picking up two games that are closing in on 2 decades old, especially when you consider that this will be significantly marketed to people who are newcomers and more casual players who are introduced to it via the Super Mario Galaxy film? I think there may be something in that. However, I have an even more bonkers theory, which is that there is a 2026 3D Mario title still on the slate for the end of that year, but it's not by EPD8, or at least not primarily by them. That game is still to come, and I would expect the EPD8 Mario to be around 2029 in this theory, following the surely to be expected third movie, and after the Switch 2's install base is massive enough for the game to take in absolute megabucks on launch. How could all of this work? Well, let's take a look back and see how I'm joining the dots, and you can make your own judgments. Recall how Shuntaro Furukawa mentioned at a recent investors briefing the need to find ways to manage longer development times for Nintendo titles. This seems like one way of doing it, by having a Splinter team working on a different title, a strategy we already saw with EPD8 when it comes to Donkey Kong. We have known for ages that Nintendo sees 3D Mario as having two separate styles: sandbox and course-based. Sandbox always seemed like the intuitive first option to drop from the sky, but if Nintendo were developing both, then a course-based game might feel like an anticlimax after a major open title. Therefore, it might make sense to prioritize a course-based Mario release first, and there's surely no more iconic course-based game in 3D than Galaxy. Let's also recap some of my prior speculation. Firstly, we know that EPD8's Yuka Kitahara, a lead level designer on Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, has had two recent games where much of the legwork was done by Nintendo Software Planning in Redmond, Washington. NST is mysterious in that the only evidence of its scale and size I can find publicly is as part of Nintendo of America, which is growing fast, but you only have to look at its hiring pages to see that it is still growing. Now, Nintendo's approach with teams taking on franchises far less precious to it than 3D Mario is to let them dip a toe in the water with a remake or remaster, a smaller project, and then move towards something original. But wasn't the Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury exactly that? My line of thinking always was that they would move on to something of a similar scale, Super Mario Galaxy 2 and a Plus game. But what if they're not doing a Plus game? What if they're doing what Grezzo did after Link's Awakening and what Mages did after the Famicom Detective Club remakes? What if they're moving on to a brand new game, legitimately working on Super Mario Galaxy 3? Okay, I know it's sounding crazy so far, and it probably is, but consider a few other things as well. Firstly, Nintendo leapfrogged making a Super Mario World movie to make Galaxy the focus of the second film. This may have been a creative decision by the movie people, but I don't know that Illumination are likely to be all that fussed about whether they feature Rosalina or Yoshi. Yes, Galaxy is an exciting name, and I suppose space always looks good in the cinema, but in many respects, World is probably more iconic, especially after Mario Kart World, and the progression of Brothers to World to Galaxy would make, in some respects, more sense in terms of scaling up and up between films. No, this feels to me like primarily a Nintendo decision. The purpose of these films is ultimately to serve the games. Furukawa is always talking about how these initiatives must feed back into their hardware-software business. They made a Brothers film releasing in 2023, and then they released a Super Mario Brothers game in 2023. If they release a Galaxy film, surely a Galaxy game to follow it also makes sense. Consider further that Koizumi is now the head of the whole of the EPD operation, and Galaxy was always his baby. He's far too senior for day-to-day shepherding of any particular project, but I think it's unlikely that he wouldn't take a particular interest in Super Mario Galaxy 3 if one were in development, and particularly if a newer team were developing it. He's always had an eye on Mario development, but arguably the core EPD8 team don't require his input nearly as much as another team might if it was their first major Mario title. Consider also Donkey Kong Bonanza and its super abrupt DLC drop in the September Direct. Usually, Nintendo luxuriates in its DLC. Splatoon and Animal Crossing waited a leisurely year and a half before getting anything new. Breath of the Wild was a bit different with its expansion pass, but Bonanza seems to have had its paid DLC drop in one go. Now, I think there are specific reasons why this might be, which I will address in a Bonanza-specific video, but I do think one key thing to consider is that quite simply they want to fill their boots with Donkey Kong now before moving the focus on. They know Donkey Kong can't compete with Mario, so they need to capitalize on the attention for the character now, because come the next year, our eyes are going to be on the big new thing. Next, consider Nintendo Software Technologies' output in recent years. Mario vs. Donkey Kong was fun, but not a brand new title, and frankly, we don't even know if it had been ported previously before it was released in 2024 and might have been sitting on a shelf for a long time before. F-Zero 99's credits suggest that it was not the product of the whole team, but was worked on by maybe a couple of dozen Nintendo Software Technology staff. It feels completely plausible to me that there is a substantial group in Redmond, probably a decent chunk of people also in Tokyo, and perhaps even other groups working on some kind of 3D Mario experience. When Nintendo developed Super Mario Bros. Wonder, they cast the net far and wide for madcap ideas, and with video conferencing making the world smaller than ever, it seems possible that Nintendo could draw in talent much more widely across their large and diversified range of subsidiaries than they have done before, especially for something of the nature of a course-based Mario, which relies on a wide and imaginative variety of ideas. A full open world game would be a different matter. You need cohesion for that, and so you probably need a more focused singular team like the Tokyo developers. But Mario Maker has proved that even a relatively small number of variables can produce some stunning variety, and Nintendo has the best people in the business to think of incredible creative ideas. Consider also Nintendo's long-term plans. Sure, a massive 3D Mario can come out in 2026, but if this happens, what about 2029? Or if they do a Donkey Kong flick in 29, then surely 2030, when they will have another Super Mario movie and they will need a game to follow it up. They will assuredly want a Mario title to follow up a third film, just the same as the first two. What do they do then, though? They could probably get away with a 2D game, but they did this with the first movie. Doing another 2D game to sell to the movie audience hardly has a sense of the scale ratcheting ever up in terms of Nintendo's ambitions following these games. This is why I think Galaxy 3 would not be the next full EPD8 Mario, but rather a game developed primarily by, or at least in strong partnership with, a different studio. Consider even more the way that Nintendo likes to use its lower key ports to bolster sales before bringing the hammer down with a new entry in a particular series. Donkey Kong Country Returns HD came before Donkey Kong Bonanza. Bayonetta 1 plus 2 came before the, sadly quite delayed, Bayonetta 3. Luigi's Mansion 3DS came before the announcement of Luigi's Mansion 3. Doesn't this feel very much like the way that Galaxy 1 plus 2 could be released and then Galaxy 3 might follow? What would all this mean for EPD8 though? Well, we know that they developed the core prototype for Donkey Kong Bonanza before Takashi's team took it home from about 2020. We know that they were involved in and by some accounts developed a prototype for Bowser's Fury that NST took to the finish line in February 2021. But what if, at this point, they weren't done splitting? What if a team, possibly under Kitahara, was teamed with Nintendo Software Technology to start a Bonanza-sized development starting in 2020? A roughly 6-year project that would come to fruition in 2026. This would be the biggest course-based Mario title yet in development times, and with the super-powered graphics of the Switch 2, it would certainly be a major tentpole title. But this would give the core Tokyo team a whopping 9 years to take us somewhere completely new with Mario. A sandbox Mario game that wouldn't compete with Galaxy 3, but which would redefine the series and take it in completely new directions. Quite probably an open world game, or at least a title with huge elements of openness. You might reasonably say, why would Nintendo want to wait on having its most major team with its most major game? But actually, because of the long crossover period of Switch to Switch 2, they can actually afford to wait. I don't know if they would make a putative Super Mario Galaxy 3 cross-platform, and most likely they wouldn't, but with Game Share, I think they would find some way to emphasize the potential to play with existing Switches, and so it will be a far more natural crossover game. What if it's a multiplayer game where having people with multiple Switches would be hugely beneficial? If you could play not just as Mario, but also Luigi, Peach and Rosalina using Game Share, Switch 2 goes from being an expensive version of the system you already have to being an essential complement to the whole home video game setup, where people have multiple Switches and can enjoy a game together. Let's put this then into forecasting terms. Is there going to be a mainline Mario title in holiday 2026? I honestly can't imagine a world where Nintendo wouldn't move heaven and earth to try to deliver that, but I guess it's plausible that game delays could push things into 2027. I'm therefore going to put this at 70%. Given that, which is more feasible to have been developed in the 5 years or so since Bonanza spun off? A course-based title or an open world game? Well, to me, it feels like this time period would suggest a course-based title. But are they honestly likely to not do an open world Mario, something that seems like the closest equivalent to actually printing money you can legally do? No, that has to be on the cards. Therefore, I think 30% there will be a course-based Mario in holiday 2026. They could get away with a 3D Mario Maker using mouse mode or even another 2D Mario, but I think a course-based title is really what they need at this point. Even if they do a 3D Mario Maker, which is by no means certain, surely they would want to get the most out of course-based gameplay on the Switch 2 first. Now, of all the course-based options, they don't have to go for Galaxy, but given the titles they've used for the course-based 3D games have all been territory related, land, world or galaxy, and they've just have done a Galaxy film, I'd say it's 30% likely that Super Mario Galaxy 3 could be coming to follow up the film within 2 years and probably in late likely October 2026. If there's another option, it would be to expand out Super Mario 3D Land, of course. This is a highly accessible game that is trapped on 3DS and would sell as new to a lot of people. Standard logic says keep it for the Mario 45th anniversary, but if you wanted a whole bunch of free levels to drop into a title, 3D Land has this. And then Nintendo Software Technology and the Splinter team from EPD8 could work on their own additions without the need to create the whole chassis of a game to build around it. I think that's less likely at this point than Galaxy, and if they're not doing Galaxy, I would expect that, like Super Mario Bros. Wonder, they will go with a completely original game-specific title. But it would be an easier ride for them if they went in this direction. And I think we will find out sooner rather than later. Galaxy 3 wouldn't need as long a hype cycle as a true new Mario. It's a game that's far more of a known quantity. It could be announced in a direct in June 2026 and still drop in October. I suspect they wouldn't want to cannibalize their Galaxy 1 Plus 2 sales by announcing it any earlier during the movie's release period, but it really is the easiest sell ever. It is the game of the movie, in effect, and I'm sure it would do absolutely superb numbers for them in the 2026 holiday window. Of course, all of this could be mushroom pie in the sky. I will have more directs follow up soon, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, huge thanks as ever to my Patreon supporters, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.